I started working part-time at a local gas station convenience store over the summer of 2016 to earn some extra money while attending college. When I was hired, I was informed that female employees were never scheduled to work overnight shifts for very obvious reasons, which I was relieved to hear. I wasn't so much worried about my safety, but I was concerned about getting enough sleep before classes. It wasn't long before I found myself dreading the days I had to work though, as the job turned out to be much more difficult than I had anticipated. We were always short-staffed, which forced us to constantly multitask between running cash registers, prepping food, keeping eyes on pumps, etc. And to make matters worse, the two women who managed the place were awful in every way. I always found myself biting my tongue and talking myself out of quitting. I was especially on edge when they cut our 15-minute break down to 10, and then I never seemed to have enough time to use the bathroom or take a smoke break anymore. But it wasn't until several annoying encounters with a regular that I finally started to break. His name was James. He was younger than me, maybe late teens or early 20s, and he thought he owned the place. Perhaps being the grandson of one of the managers gave him a sense of entitlement to mess with people there. The first time I met James, he approached the counter to purchase some chewing tobacco. As I was ringing him up, I asked to see his ID, and he told me who he was related to, but I politely asked again to see his ID. Another employee heard our conversation and assured me he was old enough, so I went ahead and rang him up. Staring at me intently the whole time, he looked down at my name tag and said, "Mindy, that's a pretty name." I thanked him for the compliment and gave him his tobacco, but he continued talking to me and asking several personal questions. He wanted to know what my last name was, whether or not I had a boyfriend, and where I lived. Meanwhile, a long line had formed behind him, and not trying to be rude, I'd said something like, "Sorry, there's a line behind you," and I casually motioned for the next customer to move up. But James didn't leave. He just stepped to the side and continued talking to me and watching me as I rang each customer up. It was uncomfortable and unsettling for me, but I did my best to pretend like I wasn't bothered, even when his persistence escalated to the point where another coworker had to ask him to leave. James soon began to make more appearances after that, the second time being with his girlfriend and a male friend by his side. Yeah, he had a girlfriend, and I was very confused when he started flirting with me again, right in front of her. But oddly enough, she didn't say a word, so I brushed it off and played along, assuming he's just the goof that my coworker said he was. But when he sat at a table with them in the back of the store, I could still feel his eyes burning a hole right through me. Over time, I grew more suspicious of James, as I would witness him do and say countless things to hurt people. I knew that he was annoying, and I had learned to brush it off as an all-in-good fun type of humor like everyone else did. But when I caught him making fun of another coworker to her face, all I could feel was anger towards him. I removed her from the situation by taking her place at the register, and I could tell she was very hurt and embarrassed by his comments. And by doing so, it was apparent to James that I didn't approve. He would continue to cruelly harass this poor girl and even some of the customers who came in, but trying to make him stop was like scolding a child. I didn't lash out at him though, I just began to ignore him. James then started playing these mind games with me while I was working. He would take soda and candy, walk outside without paying for it, and then come back in the store and say that I forgot to ring it up, loud enough for everyone to hear. One night, he even filled up his gas tank and took off without paying for it, before returning to say that he forgot to pay. He knew he'd always get away with it because Granny was the manager. It wouldn't have surprised me if he really was stealing gas and food from there. There was something very dark and strange lurking behind his goofball facade, and I avoided him like the plague, even though it was nearly impossible. Then, one day, when it was just me and another coworker, we were very busy with tasks as usual, when lo and behold, James walks in by himself, and I walked straight back into the freezer to finish what I was working on earlier. And then, he followed me inside the freezer. I didn't know he was there until he walked right up behind me and asked why I didn't greet him anymore. Startled, I jumped and quickly turned around, grabbing my chest and asking him what the hell he was doing back there. He laughed as I told him that only employees could be there. He ignored everything I said and instead proceeded to ask me personal questions, just like he did the first day I met him. "You never told me where you live," he said. "I'm curious about you. I just want to know. Tell me where you live." He was moving closer and closer towards me, literally backing me into a corner of the freezer. "Are you afraid of me, Mindy?" he asked. I tried to push past him, telling him to move, but he kept stepping in front of me to block my way out. "Not until you answer me," he said. I started calling out for my coworker, who showed up and gave him hell for being in the freezer. I was finally able to push past James, and I made my way up to the front counter when I looked at the clock and saw that it was time for me to go home. I gathered my things and punched out as quickly as I could, but James followed me out to the parking lot. I swiftly got into my car, but James grabbed the top of my door before I was able to shut it. "Come on, just let me see your ID," he persisted. I repeatedly told him no, before I found myself practically begging for him to let go of my door so I could go home. He then grinned at me and said, "Don't make me follow you, Mindy." Chills ran down my spine, knowing how bold of a person he was and considering the fact that he literally just cornered me in the freezer only minutes ago. I highly expected him to follow through. Threatened by visions of what my drive home might look like, I became angry. I looked at him dead on before shouting, "Let go of my fucking door and stay the hell away from me." I then grabbed the door and shut it as hard as I could. He tried yanking on the handle from the outside, but luckily, I locked the car in time. He then continued to knock on my window, asking to see my ID, but I started my car and backed away from him. I turned the wheels and hightailed it out of there while he just stood and watched me speed off. I was happy to finally get away from him, but I was paranoid the whole ride home, thinking that he could just catch up to me. I ended up quitting after this and didn't care that my manager was pissed. I had enough of everything, and dealing with James was the last straw. I didn't bother explaining anything to my manager because it was apparent to me that James was probably never held accountable for anything he did wrong in life, and he likely never would be. I never saw him again after that, and I hope I never do either.